This is a karakia that was gifted to Kuri Hiakai from Ngā Whai Tibble. No mai e raro, kia hā ki roto, kia hā ki waho, kia tau mai te Māori tū, te Māori noho, te Māori tangata, te Māori atua, te Māori o rangi, te Māori o tangaroa, te Māori o tāne, te Māori o papa tuanuku, te Māori o tū, te Māori o rongo, te Māori o haumia tiki tiki, te Māori o hine ahu one, kia tau mai te ao, kia tau mai te marama, kia hua mai, mā te katoa, Māori ora. So in this webinar series, Kuri Hiakai's intention is to make space for kōrero around the complex and broad-ranging issues that connect to our wider food systems. So we're constantly learning and forming some views on the many issues that come to play. Sometimes we're not necessarily seeking to present or persuade anyone a particular point of view, but we're trying to encourage a bit of whakawhiti kōrero. So that will help us shape our dialogue and make decisions around kai, around food. And this kōrero works towards figuring out ko tehitanga and expressing rangatiratanga. That means all of us, including you, can decide for yourselves. But in particular, we want to figure out the best way we can work towards an Aotearoa where everyone has enough. So just if you're joining us for the first time today and you haven't heard of Kuri Hiakai is a collective of people addressing the root causes of food-related poverty and working together to create a food-secure Aotearoa. This is a look at our structure. So we're governed by the Kōrero Trust, and more recently we have formed the Kuri Hiakai Zero Hunger Collective, which is a coordinated group of people, individuals who are, working together to understand how we can share resource and create a food-secure Aotearoa. This is some of the ways that we do this, by developing resources such as the one you're on now, and most importantly, ensuring our pathways are led by te tiriti or waitangi. During the webinar, please pop any questions in the chat and we can come back to these at the end, so go for it. But today we're here to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and what these mean for us here in Aotearoa, in particular Indigenous people here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the whakapapa of the SDGs and their importance globally and how they relate to us here at home. So in September 2015, the United Nations signed up to 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And these include quite a lot of indicators, over 200, and over 150 targets. So the goals kind of set out, they're kind of like our universal agenda to achieve sustainable development. And you might know them as Agenda 2030. The goals are based on lessons which were learnt from the previous goals, the Millennium Development Goals, which focus specifically on countries. And these are kind of an iteration of these. So when you look at the goals like that, I mean, that's, there's quite a lot of them and they can feel quite overwhelming. But when you break them down, they're all interlinked. So countries are expected to do what's called a voluntary national review. So Aotearoa provided one in 2019, and sitting alongside the government review is a report done, compiled by civil society. And so this was the first one in 2019, and it was called the People's Report. So it was written by communities and for communities in Aotearoa, and it kind of provides an alternative to the government's official report by highlighting a lot more grassroots experiences, understanding gaps, and community-led solutions. So a lot of the information contained in that report was from your stories, your data, and over 30 recommendations, which is an attempt to make the report real, relevant, and powerful to implement. So there is Aotearoa Sustainable Development Goal Alliance. And so they've been meeting regularly, led by Matt Morris and Iris Paho and Dana Harvey. and they're in the process, or we're in the process of creating the next People's Report this year. So if you're interested in that, pop your name in the chat or email and I can fill you in about that. So the Sustainable Development Goals are ambitious, but here are some facts around how progress is not moving fast enough, which is a little bit depressing, so we won't dwell too much on that one. So they're intended for, the goals are intended for countries and people to work together to improve the livelihoods of everybody. So the New Zealand, the Auditor General's report in 21 took a look at New Zealand and interviewed a few people, some departments, us, and kind of asked the question, what role do they play with New Zealand? And so these were some of the points from that report. So needing to clarify, will it set targets? And one of the recommendations from the People's Report was that there needed to be a minister for the social development goals. So that would ensure that there was a bit more kōtahitanga across the government departments. So it's really interesting that the Auditor General has that, and that's something that we refer to, and hopefully it would be good to get a Minister of Social Development Goals. So thinking about zero hunger in New Zealand, here are some unfun facts. This was taken from Rebalancing Our Food System Public Health Advisory Committee in 2024. I think the paper was, it'll be on there, food imports and exports of New Zealand in relation to the food-based dietary guidelines. And so, we can see from this that we do produce enough food to feed people. And we're also reminded that, food security, and I know that a lot of you already know this, is a symptom of poverty and colonisation, which again is a symptom of the deep structural issues such as relentless colonisation and power imbalances. But we also know that food insecurity won't be solved with a charitable model of food based on food aid. And we know that's not a long-term solution. So if we think of goal 2, zero hunger, we know it's linked to decent work, no poverty, environmental issues. Here's another kind of a link to New Zealand's export. And this talks a little bit about in 1847, 4,000 vessels carrying food left Ireland for England, while 400,000 people in Ireland died. And so I guess it's just highlighting how exports are favoured over local food security. So thinking about those things and thinking about what's needed to change or to move us towards zero hunger, if you don't mind, I'm really interested in answering the following question. If you could change one thing in our food system tomorrow to move towards zero hunger, what could that be? And again, we've got the teachers striking today. We've had nurses striking recently. And so it is more than food. As we know, it's about better accommodation, it's about better wages. So it's a lot more than just food. So before I mentioned, if you just pop those in the chat, that'd be really appreciated. So before, when we talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, we talked about how there's a whole lot of targets that come from each goal. And so I'm just going to talk about a couple of the targets around zero hunger. And so target 2.5 is maintaining the genetic diversity in food production. And so we're thinking about the industrial model of agriculture can be the biggest threat to food security. All our food, as we know, is produced through agriculture, and agriculture relies on nature and is deeply connected to the soil. So, we're experiencing human-induced climate change at record levels around the world, and how we got a duty to protect this. How do we feed the world, and how do we get food to those who need it? Thinking about those targets, these are some really interesting facts. 400,000 species of plant on Earth only are half ever by humans. And thinking about the 150 plant species, of those, a third of them supply the world with rice, wheat, and maize. So Thinking about genetic diversity, we're thinking about and Jack, you might want to correct me later on or put this in a better way, the number of genetic characteristics in the makeup of a species. And the thing to note when we're talking about genetic diversity is it's possible to bring out the best of the diversity to get more favourable crops. And so what does that tell us when it comes to hunger? So everyone has a right to benefit from genetic diversity that is found in nature. And we can use crop diversity to create more varieties. I'm sure backyard gardeners have experienced this themselves. But there is another way, unfortunately. Once a company has done this, they then have IP over seeds. And we've seen a lot of this around the world where food producers are bound into unprofitable and unequal relationships through IP of these seeds. Just to talk a bit about what this could look like, and this is a picture of, this is in Peru at the Papadilla Park, which is a whole lot of hapu high in the hills who maintain potato crops. And so each kind of hapu has a specific potato that they look after and they manage. And so the international seed potato bank was collecting samples, and there was a bit of reluctance. We were there in, I think, 2006 with Tahuti Whenua. So they were saying that there was a bit of reluctance to put their seed in the potato bank because they were worried, what would happen to it. And then through human-induced climate change, a couple of seasons later, they lost one of their kind of ancestral crops. And so they were able to go back to the potato bank and get some more of the what they needed to then continue to grow these. So that's kind of a good example of what the seed bank was able to do. But on a more local level, this is a picture of the one at the Otaki Library. And so these are some of the locally sourced seeds that are exchanged. Okay, so we've got another target. So remember, I said there's a whole lot of targets that come under each goal. So target 2.4, sustainable food production and resilient agricultural practices. So thinking about what sustainable food production might look like, and understanding how to diversify plant varieties, and investing in smallholder farms. Thinking about, I just want to go back to the genetic resilience of some crops. So in New Zealand, and you may or may not be familiar with this particular apple, but we can think of the Monty Surprise apple, and that was one that Mark Christensen at the Heritage Crops and his team have been researching. And through their research, they noted that, and he quotes this, if people in New Zealand and eventually around the world ate this unique high health apple, over time, this would have the effect of lowering the overall incidence of chronic disease within our communities. And so that's because of the high levels of something in the apple. And also, if we think of the moon glow tomato as another one, so that has really high levels of I think it's called tetracyclisopene. But it's a great example of genetic diversity that favours nutrition, is really good for us, and favours nutrition over corporate control. So thinking about how do we support Indigenous people around these targets, here are a couple of examples. And so ensuring we're involved in the food system thinking, ensuring that we have a voice at the table, and ensuring that time, resources and power is shared with all of us. Another target I just want to talk about is target 2.3. And so that's an important one, double the productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers. So small-scale food producers typically earn less and produce less, but they're essential for our local food system. So if you think about where you live now, if you're on the call, think about where you live, and think about the small-scale producers that we're thinking about. So things like the food co-ops such as Co-shop, Maikai in the Hawke's Bay, community-supported agriculture, all the kind of food bags that you can buy each week, and the self-serve vendings, and the farm shop. So these all create a direct link between the grower and the consumer, which shortens the distribution gap, but it also ensures that food is eaten when it's at its most nutrient dense. So affordable food is the goal, and valuing food growing as an academic subject is an essential role because it's mainly run by volunteers. Here's some outstanding Uriniki potatoes. Now, this was at Chantal Organics last week, so that's a good example of locally grown. And then here is Auntie's Garden. So this is another example of small-scale food producers that sell direct to the community. So while we're trying to double the income, we also need to secure markets. So we need markets so that our small-scale producers can have somewhere to sell these. So I guess when we think about supporting local farmers, it goes beyond buying fresh food. It's a way to strengthen community interaction. It's a way to preserve our traditions. And you're not only getting, high quality items, but you're contributing to sustainable practices, which in turn contribute to the SDGs. And so I guess my point is, yes, there are hunger, but under that come a whole lot of different targets that are more than just food. So thinking about the SDGs, we want to kind of take a holistic approach to the SDGs, and so we can't really have the biodiversity conversation without thinking about food. We can't have food without thinking about life below water. Can't have food without thinking about climate change. So they're all interlinked together. Now, not everyone is a fan of the SDGs, and so this is just my view. I like them. There are others that don't think they're a good idea, that they might be seen as incoherent or neoliberal, or there's too many of them. Another common complaint is they don't really deal with democracy or climate justice or human rights. And so, yeah, they're not perfect. And they didn't include, there's no SDG. So Rangatahi will say there's no SDG around Rangatahi or Indigenous people. But they were really developed with a lot of leaders, a lot of people. And so there was days and weeks, months spent around tables, joint interventions to try and get them to this point. So they are a way to hold government account for progress, even though this is voluntary. They can be a tool for local voices to instigate local and global action, and they can be a platform to alleviate Indigenous knowledge. So ideally what we want, I like little wee kids' book pictures, is we want to move from food as aid, and we want to move towards kai motu haki, where there is enough for all. So if I think about the SDGs, how does that matter to me? It might be something like I look after my family primarily, and then my iwi, my hapu, my community, and then thinking about what I do might have an impact on someone else on the other side of the world. And so there are a lot of Indigenous views to the SDGs. And we know in Aotearoa that our current system is built on layers of land theft, and that's experienced worldwide. So if we're thinking of a global response to the SDGs, in particular zero hunger, there are massive land grabs from agribusinesses, and there are lots of cases of Indigenous communities who have lost land, especially in Africa. So where they're the most insecure. And a lot of that is through nomadic communities, and also a Western requirement to have documented land, which we know a lot of our people move and inherit land through whakapapa, which is not necessarily documented. But we're not unfamiliar with this in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so a quick look on, the Te Mata series will talk about how at home Māori are suffering from this still. And thinking about, I just want to really bring this up as, because it is a really, Indigenous people are dying and are being murdered defending land around the world. So I think this was 2023, so 196 people were killed trying to defend their whenua, trying to defend their water. And so these are real issues. Berta was another one. And so we have a lot of Indigenous people at the UN who support the SDGs, but also trying to take a rights-based approach and protect whenua. These are just some photos from there. And it's important, I think, when we think about what does that mean for Māori, is that Māori are right holders, not stakeholders. And so we can't really defend our rights if we don't know what they are. And so what does that look like for us? There's another small-scale producer in Sri Lanka. So thinking about reclaiming our food systems, what could this be? So we know corporate solutions are not the answer, and we know that reconnecting with our whenua and our pūrākau and ourselves and Indigenous leadership is one of the solutions. Thinking about what else this might mean around SDG 2. So these are some of the ideas to think about: re-indigenising and decolonising, which is a really big part of the work that Hiakai are doing, and leading with Te Tiriti Waitangi leadership. So I guess what we're saying is to implement the SDGs requires a whole of society approach, and that starts with you, it starts with me, and it starts with our whānau and communities to move towards kaimotuhake. So just thinking a bit about yourselves and some of the mahi that you're doing, or maybe in your workplace or maybe in your community, what examples of Indigenous-led food solutions have you seen or heard about or are supporting? It's not a form of judgment, it's just you probably do more than you think you do, that's all. So pop those in the chat for me and that would be appreciated. So you're most likely already implementing the SDGs, you just don't know it. And so it's good to maybe identify which SDGs you're supporting, or you could think about what kaupapa. So if you think about your kaupapa, put that first, your kaupapa tuatahi, and then go through the SDGs and have a look and see which ones you link to. So I'm going to give you a quick, stay with me whānau, I'm nearly finished. I'm just going to give you a quick, some quick examples of some organisations that explicitly demonstrate the SDGs on their website. So here we've got the Eagle Project, and they're also B Corp certified. Here we go. This is the University of Canterbury. So with the university, you can choose your course by goal. So if you go through and think about what you want to study, that will come under the Sustainable Development Goal, which I think is pretty cool. And United Fresh, so they've got explicit targets on their website as well. So that was a really good case study. So if you want one to have a look at, that's where I go. And of course, we've got the Waikato Sustainable Development Goals, who are doing some huge work in this area. So I guess what I'm trying to demonstrate is it's not, if you decide that this is something, yeah, actually the Sustainable Development Goals are important, let's go for it. These are some places you can look to see how other organisations have begun to implement them in their workplace. So next month, we've got the Sustainable Development Summit happening at Massey Palmerston North. So go online, have a look, register for that. There's some really amazing speakers, and that will give you a bit more of a taste around the SDGs, and you can see how people are enacting them. There is also the People's Report, which is happening. So if you've got some interest in that, please reach out. But the 4th and 5th of September, jump online, register for that and get along to there. My favourite SDG is Partnership for the Goals, because if we don't prioritise and work out our partnerships, we simply won't achieve the other goals. And a kind of example of that, or a good example of that, is Kore Hiakai have set up a collective. And so collectively, we can start working towards some of the SDG goals, in particular, zero hunger. Last slide, whānau. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for implementing the SDGs in your mahi. I'm going to hand it over to Jack soon, but actually it does matter. So if you think it doesn't matter, it really does. What we do here does have an impact on someone in the other side of the world. So yeah, give it a go. Have a look on the website. Have a look at your SDGs, and see which ones we can implement. So thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. So thank you so much. I am going to change tact a bit. Thank you, Jack. Where do I start, Jack? Well, first of all, thank you so much for being with Kuri Hiakai today. Jack grew up and went to school on land taken by the Treaty of St. Louis in 1804. He wasn't born in 1804. From the Chippewa, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and the Ho-Chunk Nation. He then went to graduate school on the land of the Kulapua tribes. He worked for the NIH on the land of the Salish and the Lusitania tribes, and now lives on the land of the First Nation peoples. So I just want to stop right there. That is Jack's auto signature. And I just want to say that is a beautiful example of decolonization and re-indigenisation. And so I really thank you for that, Jack. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Yeah, I might pop that in the chat too, so people can see that, because it's fabulous. So Jack is going to discuss with us some of the gene narrative around human-induced climate change, but also use a food security nutrition example to illustrate the mismatch and lock in those results from the narrative. Why is this important, you might ask? Well, gene technology is often posed as the answer to climate change and food security. But those of us who know how to compost and mulch and save seed know that if we were just a bit more resourced, we might have that answer too. So over to you, my friend. Again, Whānau, please pop any questions in the chat, and we'll come back to them at the end with Jack. Kia ora. Thank you, Jack.
Kia ora, koutou, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm going to kick off. I'll just give this a start here. Right. Fantastic. So I'm hoping that everyone can see my slides and in the right presentation mode. Moko, is that the case? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. So I am going to talk about hunger and the Sustainable Development Goal for Zero Hunger. And I'm going to take a particular lens, as Moko has indicated, to look at it from the point of view of a technological problem that's in want of a technological solution. So the way I got involved in this is that I was one of the authors on the panel for climate change, the IPCC report number 6, where I was specifically asked as an author to look at the role of gene technology to mitigate, and in plants in particular, to mitigate the effects of plant biotechnology, of climate change. And as a result of that work, we were invited to put together a special issue and of a journal. And that's what I'm showing you here on this first slide, is that this will be based on a paper that I've done with a former PhD student, Tessa Hiscox. So the question I'm going to try to address is, can these kinds of technological narratives, in particular those for gene technology, can they push out hunger? The Sustainable Development Goals all have high aspirations. And depending on how we address those aspirations, we can get very different results. We call this two kind of views, a technology push view and a goal pull view. And they have different outcomes, but they also have a different resonance in different societies. So a technology push kind of model starts with inventions where you prioritize innovation and intellectual property rights, those kinds of ways to generate sellable commercial solutions to problems. But the invention isn't necessarily tied around that initial objective, which is your goal. So once the technology exists, there's a dedicated search for a problem to apply it to. And that often leads then to a plethora of promises. So those who have a technology, a technique, want to be able to convince others that their technique is a useful adaptation or adoption for whatever problem they have. And then if they're successful, their technology is implemented. And then the result is either it is a solution to a problem, as they have described it in their problem search, or it fails and disappears. And despite all the promises and the hype that went around it initially, we forget about it. So the technology push cycle is driven by promises for a hypothetical or a new technology and are characterized by a solution to a problem coming before the problem itself. The alternative way of looking at things is what I call a goal pull. And here you prioritize the aspiration or the objective first. So you've already identified the problem and what it is you're trying to solve. You then have an open mind towards a solution space. And that solution space doesn't have to be limited to the production of an intellectual property right that you can use to license or sell some kind of new invention. So it takes us out of that kind of framework where the cause of a problem is always just the absence of some kind of technology. So that solution space can be true solutions, not just responses to the problem, and they can address the underlying causations of those problems. You then implement whatever it is that you're testing in your implementation, in your solution space, and ultimately then measure your progress against the goal. How well is that working to achieve your aspiration? And there's two possible outcomes. You get progress towards the goal, fantastic, and you keep going, or you find that you haven't done necessary what it was necessary to achieve sufficient progress to the goal. But if you have adjusted, if you have identified appropriately the kinds of solutions and the right kinds of measures, then the failures at this stage can inform the next round of the cycle. Rather than just being forgotten and abandoned, we learn each time the cycle turns and get closer and closer to achieving our goal. So the goal pull cycles are characterized by that they're driven by an attraction to an objective rather than they are driven by innovation and invention that is running largely in parallel to true social problems. We can see this, we can see these cycles in operation every day. And when it comes to SDG2, we often see the problem as formed as the absence of a technology. So agri-tech seeks to improve the food system through the development of high-tech tools. Many ag tech startups promise to deliver increased agricultural productivity while also enhancing food system sustainability. And you can see in this graphic how that fits into the technology push. There's an invention, say a means, a new gene technology like a genome editor, CRISPR-Cas. There's the search for a problem. Uh-oh, we have too many people. We can't feed them all. So we're going to apply our invention. And what we'll do is promise to change plants or other organisms in a way that can address some of our food security concerns. And then we'll turn food security into a goal, ultimately, that we are seeking to achieve. So you can see how often the narrative of technology developers begins and ends in a technology cycle. Also within the goal push, you can express the goal in such a way as to make it a de facto technology, a technology push kind of approach. So if the goal is expressed as a technical challenge, it will turn into a de facto technology push. So that simply by expressing the goal of hunger as a problem in the amount of food we have, then it becomes a problem in plant productivity, and then it becomes reduced to a metric such as biomass per external input into producing those plants. And you can see this often in the literature about food and global hunger. The projections show that feeding a world population of 9 billion people in 2050 would require raising overall food production by some 70%. By the end of this century, a 50% increase in agricultural productivity is required to feed the world. So these global food, the end of hunger is seen as the absence of enough food, and the absence of enough food is just seen as the problem of not having a technology for plants to grow bigger and faster. In a literature search of tens of thousands of published papers between the 1960s and roughly now, as you can see in this graphic here, there's been a massive switch to this kind of narrative of a production deficit, which fits well into the exact same time period for the increasing technological intensification of agriculture. So it's no surprise that now most researchers have simply accepted a productivity deficit as the problem for global food insecurity. But we know, and Mocha's already told us, that the real problem isn't the lack of food. We already on Earth produce far more food than 9 billion people need. The problem is, at its heart, a problem of poverty. So, as the FAO says, hunger is a poverty problem. It's a manifestation of a lack of access to food, not necessarily a question of food production. And as these researchers noted, our study highlights a strong imbalance in the scientific research in favor of the production lever and a lack of more holistic approaches. The dominance of production-oriented studies may undermine achieving food security and other sustainability goals, missing the advantage of potential synergies between the SDGs. So we know the problem isn't really a lack of plant growth. It's our ability to make sure that people produce the food they need when and where they need it, and that is a poverty and a war problem predominantly. So the alternative is to ensure that we express our goals in a way that allows for a goal pull cycle to operate. And here's an example that we developed within the paper. We talked about such things as food security as being achieved when you have a social well-being and you're using nutrition indicators per plant biomass rather than the plant biomass as the metric. In the first run cycle under goal pull, you set food security as your goal, and in your solution space, you look for equitable food consumption. So you're trying to make sure that everyone gets the food they need and as much of it as they need. And you have some ideas about how to do that. And those ideas will be, in this example, to decrease post-harvest losses. So especially in Western cultures, we throw away about 40% of the food that is generated. And to reduce sweetener intensive food consumptions. So to reduce the ultra-processed food consumption and the fast food access like McDonald's. And as your indicator, you look at weight profiles because malnutrition, a sign of food insecurity, reveals itself in extremes from the mean, both those who are underweight and those who are overweight. Both of those are symptoms of malnutrition and food insecurity. And what you might find the first time you do this is that you haven't made enough progress to the goal, that there's something missing in what you've tried to achieve because the weight profiles haven't changed enough. So you can go back to the solution space and tweak your solution space. You wouldn't abandon the last run entirely, but what we're going to add here is we're going to want to, in addition to equitable food consumption, introduce the metric of better nutrition. And for better nutrition then to be implemented, there's going to be the introduction of local polycultures rather than reliance on international and even domestic monocultures as our food sources. And we're going to add that to the decrease in post-harvest losses and sweetener intense food consumption. And when we measure weight profiles after introducing these implementation measures, what we might find is that we do have significant progress to our goal. And then we'll be able to exit the cycle on having achieved the goal of food security. But the main lesson here is that each cycle informs the next cycle rather than asynchronous, anti-parallel invention cycles that then hope to find relevance by appealing to a problem that can be post hoc identified. And an example of this productivity technology push approach is seen in, for example, the claims that if plants could only photosynthesize more, we would have more food. And you see this often in the literature where there's where a paper is published that says, wow, we tweaked a gene and we were able to get a lot more biomass from these plants. And therefore, if applied to agricultural plants, we could do more to feed the world. The issue here, as an example in photosynthesis, is that photosynthesis is a very complex and systematic kind of activity of a plant. And it doesn't just depend on the sun and carbon dioxide. There's all sorts of elements that contribute to what we see as photosynthetic effect. And it does include light and CO2 availability, but it's also influenced by temperature, by access to micronutrients like mineral elements, moisture levels, and macro ingredients like nitrogen. So it's much more complex than just the amount of carbon that can be fixed per photon. And a frequently identified target, though, by gene technologists is that Rubisco enzyme, which is the enzyme that is responsible for fixing atmospheric carbon from carbon dioxide into metabolites like sugars. Now, the thing about Rubisco is it's a protein that evolved when the Earth had very little oxygen in its atmosphere. And so it never had to be very discerning about whether it used oxygen or carbon dioxide as a substrate because there just wasn't much oxygen around. There was only carbon dioxide for it to worry about. And as the Earth's atmosphere became more and more full of oxygen about 2 billion years ago, this started to become an efficiency limitation. And the way plants dealt with that is there was a selection for Rubisco enzymes that were much more focused on carbon dioxide rather than oxygen. But this decreased the rate of the reaction, the efficiency of the photosynthetic reaction, which is what freezes plants at their current efficiency. To deal with this, plants just made more of the enzyme. So they had a less efficient Rubisco, but they just made lots more of it. And that's why Rubisco is often referred to as the most abundant protein on Earth, because they have to make so much of it to make up for its lack of efficiency. As our atmosphere becomes more and more enriched for carbon, yes, plants become more efficient because the Rubisco enzyme becomes more efficient because it doesn't have oxygen competing for its active sites. So we might just think then that either by inducing climate change to make our world hotter or by changing Rubisco, we will make more food. But that's a narrow-sighted view of how photosynthesis holistically works. So this group of researchers took a deep dive into the issue, and what they found was that a surprising aspect of this focus on photosynthesis is that already by the 1990s, it had become increasingly clear that increasing crop yield was not closely associated with the rate of photosynthesis. So that if you do focus on such things as photosynthesis and rubisco, you fail to focus on nutrient accumulation. And if you measure the wrong thing, such as green biomass over seed biomass, you may end up actually with a counterintuitive outcome, which is lower yields. So yield increases are closely dependent on nitrogen accumulation, and you can't increase photosynthesis efficiency without also using more nitrogen. And carbon accumulation in the absence of additional nitrogen doesn't increase yield. And yield increases require greater nitrogen accumulation, plant nitrogen storage, and ultimate transfer to growing seeds, all of which are genetically controlled. So a simple view of looking at rubisco isn't going to change into more food. These types of technology push, such as we see in the gene tech narrative, have a tendency to aggravate the very problem that they were invented to solve. And here's a couple of observations of that from the literature, including from our own. This problem also involves crop cultivars that suffer from modern agricultural industry trends. Multiple cultivars are replaced by single champions for better productiveness and logistics. Over the decades, the pressure exerted by natural and artificial selection has progressively reduced the genetic diversity of many crops. And this is what Moko was pointing out. There's a real deficit in our loss of biodiversity because we lose that kind of ability to for plants to exist in different kinds of ecozones and produce food at different rates in different places. And when it came to photosynthesis itself, increased photosynthesis efficiency may not increase effective yield. It reduces the nutritional value of plant protein and micronutrient density. Photosynthesis increases depend on more nitrogen. Added nitrogen is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. A third of global nitrous oxide emissions come from production of nitrogenous fertilizer and field emissions. So the solution exacerbates the very problem by driving down the nutritional quality of plants as we make more plant biomass. And in doing so, we generate more greenhouse gas emissions, which further produce extreme outcomes in our environment and disenfranchise smallholder farmers from the ability to make their own food. So in conclusion, can we use these kinds of technology pushes to eliminate hunger? And my answer to that, I think, is that it's unlikely that these are going to be successful ways. We've been doing it now for over 100 years and haven't gotten much closer to eliminating world hunger. So 3 points. 1, genetically modified plants and other organisms are not the only purpose or product of a gene technology. But making GMOs is the activity of only a tiny minority of scientists. Yet this is the kind of narrative we are most familiar with. Let's make GMOs to save us from some kind of other problem that we've created. Second, gene technology can contribute to agriculture in many ways. These include identifying and concentrating desirable traits and reducing food waste. It does not have to simply be used to make a genetically modified organism. But the real quick kick is number 3. Gene technology is far more powerful as a distraction from the problem, leading to false solutions and addiction to practices that generated a need for the technology in the first place. When you are capable of monetizing the problem, you become addicted to the problem. And that's what we often see in these technology push narratives, such as being now so heavily used here in New Zealand for the gene technology and changes in gene technology regulations. So thank you for listening, and I'll return it back to you, Moko.
Oh, standing ovation, standing ovation. Thank you so much, Jack. That was a lot to get through, but also I love how you presented that, particularly the focusing on nutrition, better nutrition, and polycultures and photosynthesis. That's crazy. That doesn't correlate to producing better food. That is a lot to get through. I'm still going to absorb that for a bit. Would we be able to send that out to people with the post resources? Would that be okay?
Yeah, there may be some copyrighted images in there that we'll have to deal with, but in general, the answer is yes. I also just want to say that I just noticed that Tessa is here with us, so a shout out to Tessa, who is my co-author on this paper.
Oh, kia ora. Standing ovation for you too, Tessa. Thank you so much. That's fantastic.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tessa. Can you talk a bit about me? You in item 2, you talked about so we know in New Zealand that 40% of food, thank you, is thrown away, and you in number 2 you put example of reducing food waste. Can you just elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. How many of you are familiar with the non-browning Arctic apple from Canada? I guess that's a little bit of a rhetorical question, but gene technology has been applied to an apple variety, and now multiple varieties, to eliminate an enzyme that results in browning when you cut open the apple. There's also apples who are naturally deficient in that enzymatic activity. You can use gene technology to enrich those kinds of naturally arising traits without having to directly change the genome. So you use a gene technology to visualize the parts of the genome that are already responsible for the trait you want. And then you can use those technologies to ensure that in your breeding program, more of your offspring have that desired trait. Now, that is a use of gene technology that doesn't produce a GMO and can be applied to such intractable problems as food waste in the same way that the so-called non-browning Arctic apple has been applied. Now, an irony with the gene technology approach is that in order to protect the intellectual property rights for that Arctic apple, the company can't sell you the apple, because you could go and plant the seeds. You would be able to steal their intellectual property if the seeds were viable. So the non-browning apple, created through gene technology for the purposes of reducing food waste, is really just a way to sell plastic, because they cut the apple up, remove the seeds, and then embed it in a plastic to sell in the store or to sell to school children as snacks. So you use the gene technology to solve the apparent absence of an ability to attract children to apples because they turn brown. You turn and that results in food waste. You turn that into a new kind of waste, plastic waste.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you, Jack. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a lot to get through and a lot to consider. And we've got a comment in the chat. Want to make the distinction between inventions and social innovation. So social innovators use the gold pool model for innovation. And food security innovators, and here's an example, Africa, advocating nature-based solutions from the ancient wisdom. So it's about doing things sustainably, which is, of course, what we want to do. And just even that term nature-based solutions was problematic when it was going through the UN. The Indigenous were advocating, we were advocating for, I think it was ecosystem services at the time.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The transactional model, ecosystem services, because an ecosystem is only useful if it can do something for us.
Yeah, great. Okay, so any other questions for Jack there? Thank you so much. There's some really good examples that people have put forward about different things they're doing around the country. Parihaka, we've got Suba in Colombia. That sounds like a really good model. Aotearoa, we've got a Kai map in Hamilton. Let's check that out, and we'll put those in the resources. You talked about the problem, not the lack of plant growth. It wasn't the lack of plant growth, but that was to do with the photosynthesis, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
But if you define the problem as a lack of plant growth, then the technological solution is to make them grow more.
Yes. Yeah. And so thank you. Has anyone else got any questions there for Jack? I know we're coming up to 1 o'clock. Here's one. Do you have any strategies, Jack, to change the gene tech narrative?
Um, I guess my life is a strategy, mostly failed. And just I am a gene technologist, right? I am a genetic engineer, a lifelong genetic engineer. So I can see a lot of value in the use of the technology. I guess what I'm trying to point out, though, is that a very, very small component of gene technology is the production of organisms for sale.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And from a Hiakai perspective, we're not advocating for anything at all. We're just really trying to, put some balanced views in the room and understand further some of the narrative around this. So that's been super helpful, Jack. Really interesting, and we might have to get you back to get on some more webinars with us. So I'm gonna, if there's any other questions. We had a question here. How often do the countries have to do their VNR reports? So they are voluntary reviews, and so technically they don't actually have to do them. But typically they might do one every 5 years. So the last one that New Zealand did was 2019. So the People's Report was really preempt, so getting ready to do one because we're quite under-resourced to pull it together, whereas government could pull one out quite quickly. And so not sure when the government are going to do their next one. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. Eleanor's going to send out the link, and she's going to send out any resources that came through the webinar. Does anyone want to end with karakia, or I can end with karakia? But is anyone in the chat wanting to? Is there any real students out there that want to have a go at doing their karakia whakamutunga? Unmute yourselves. No? Okay, fine. All right, thank you again, Jack. It's really lovely to see you. I really appreciate everything that you do and how you explain it in such a way that is a bit more digestible and than what we might if we read it. So I'm going to send that out to everyone. Eleanor will send that out after the hui. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll just finish with a karakia, but we've got one more webinar coming up in a couple of weeks, so jump on and roll for that. Check out the SDGs and have a think about what you're doing in your workplace and how that relates to SDGs. I'm going to go home and tend to my plants and give them a bit more loving, a bit more compost, and get some growth. Kia ora. Whakairia te tapu, kia wāti ai te ara, kia tūriki, kia whakataha ai, kia tūriki, kia whakataha ai, haumia, huie, tāki here. Kia ora, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you. Bye.